Hi, welcome. My name is Maria Kliavkoff, and I am the founder, executive director of the Healthy Mourning Revolution, which is all about revolutionizing the way you think about grief and mourning. And today we're going to talk about disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is grief that your community, your society, your friends and neighbors don't recognize as your right to grieve. It's grief where, for whatever reason, they are minimizing your right and your need to grieve this loss. So an example of it would be if your ex-spouse, if your ex-husband or ex-wife died, and the sentiment was because you were divorced from them, you don't have a right to grieve. Sometimes a disenfranchised grief is when your spouse, maybe from same-sex marriage, and the family doesn't recognize you as the spouse. That can become disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief also happens with pet loss because people don't necessarily know the significance of your pet in your life. You know, our beloved four-legged creatures, they are our closest beings. They are our heart on four legs, right? They sleep with us, they walk with us. Sometimes we trip over them because they're so close, and they're part of our everyday life. And so when a living, loving being that has loved you and supported you unconditionally for all these years suddenly isn't there anymore, that is a devastating loss. And yet people who don't have pets may not understand the significance of it and may dismiss it. They may say things like, oh, you can just get another dog or cat, and they don't understand the nature of the relationship. And it really is all about the nature of the relationship of the person who died. One of the most devastating losses. I talk more about grief and grief that's related to pet loss in the podcast. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I encourage you to go to Healthy Mourning Revolution Radio and listen to this week's podcast because it really focuses more on pet loss. The kind of disenfranchised grief that I want to talk about here today is a very specialized grief, and it is that of a womb twin survivor, which also goes hand in hand with miscarriage and any kind of pre or perinatal loss. The significance of this kind of loss is that for many of us, and I am a womb twin survivor myself, we didn't know until much later in our lives. Our parents may or may not know the truth of this. They may have evidence of it. They may not. And when we discover it, there is a grief that is immediate. And we suddenly recognize that we have been grieving the loss of a being since the time we were in the womb. For those of us who are womb twin survivors, we've experienced loss before we had words. And grief has really done an impression on our lives. And so we have lived our lives in life patterns of what's called grief avoidance, not knowing that we were avoiding anything, not knowing that we had this huge grief that we were carrying with us, and yet that is how we have approached our life. And if you want to learn more about this or talk to me about this, I encourage you to connect with me for a private consult because it's a big part of my work, and it's something that's really essential, that we work through our grief so that we can reclaim our lives. For those of us who have carried that kind of loss and that kind of grief, often our friends have no concept. They can't even fathom what it means because we're grieving someone that we never really knew, quote unquote knew, and yet in the womb we did know. In the womb they were our closest companion. And so there are physical realities for us in our body. There are emotional realities for us. There's abandonment stuff that has come up for us that's very real and that lives in our belief system now. And so we may be living out a life that is reflective of some lessons that we mislearned in the womb. With disenfranchised grief, what it means is that even as we tell our story, even as we share this loss, people don't understand and they don't recognize the depths of the emotions that get brought up by this. Hand in hand with this are people who are grieving the loss of a child in a miscarriage, particularly if it's in the first couple of months. In North America, and I think in Western culture in general, it is notorious that we're not supposed to tell anyone when we're pregnant for the first 3 months of our pregnancy. Now, why would this be? It's because we didn't want people to have to go through the pain of telling others if we do miscarry. It became kind of a superstitious thing, and you don't want to say anything in case you lose the baby. But here's the thing about grief and loss. When a couple or a parent goes through the loss of a child before birth, there's extraordinary pain. That life was very real, and so they have to go through the grieving process. It's disenfranchised because maybe now we have to tell people that we were pregnant and that we are grieving, and we may in fact choose to follow societal protocol around not telling people about this. But then imagine the pressure on the individual who has to go into work every day as if everything is just normal. And it's not normal. They lost a beloved child, and they need time to grieve and mourn that. For the womb twin survivor, where there were 2 or more in the womb and one survived and the other one or multiples didn't survive, that individual carries with them an imprint from the womb. They carry with them that womb story and the loss in the womb. It's even more isolating and devastating if the parents aren't aware that it occurred. So in some cases, parents are aware, and it's a phenomenal number. 1 in 10 people are in fact womb twin survivors. We discovered this when suddenly doing ultrasounds became really popular. And so before that, we didn't know that a twin was in the womb. By the time the belly is large enough and we're listening for heartbeats and stuff, the twin may have already died. And so what we want to do is we want to honor, if you are a parent of somebody who is a womb twin survivor, then you also lost a child. And you become part of the story, and the grieving becomes everybody being able to talk about this incident. There are also situations of stillbirth where the twin is stillborn and there's a surviving twin. Why am I talking about this? It's because it's such a hidden part of grief. And disenfranchised is just that. It's hidden grief. It's grief that is not being allowed to be brought to the surface literally by the community, by the society that doesn't recognize the validity of it. So if you are struggling with any kind of stuck grief around disenfranchisement, where you're not feeling supported in your community, whether your community is friends and family, or it's a wider community that includes your workplace, and you're not sure what to do with that, I encourage you to contact me, because this is my area of specialty. And I feel really strongly that as we create compassionate societies that understand the importance of grief work, so will we begin to be a community of people that can work through our grief with ease and grace. It's because of our fight against it that it becomes so challenging for us. It's because of our fight against it that we suffer with it and we get stuck in it, and we're not living the lives that we were born to live, particularly womb twin survivors. We don't even know that we're stuck in it, right? We don't even know that there's a grief that happened before we were born that have been carried with us, through us, in our body, right? We just know that we have this unspeakable sadness that has trailed us our entire life, or that we constantly find ourselves isolated and alone, and that we create the environment in which we do this, and maybe we even just feel safer in an environment of this. We go to psychiatrists and they can't diagnose the problem. They're not aware of womb twin survivor because it is a relatively new study, and there are tons of books that are available. If you're curious to learn more, I encourage you to look at any book by Althea Hayton on womb twin survivor. Althea is A-L-T-H-E-A, Hayton, A-H-A-Y-T-O-N. Any of her books on womb twin survivors is a wonderful starting place. I'm going to be doing a resource review this week that will look at one of her books. And what I hope is that we can make anybody's grief a welcome space. Because the truth is, if somebody says that they're grieving, if somebody is missing the physical presence of another being, any being, that's grief. Grief is the symptoms, the constellation of emotions and thoughts and feelings that go through your body as a reaction to loss. And if somebody is experiencing loss and is experiencing this constellation, they are grieving. The way that we support them is by helping them to mourn in healthy ways, helping them to tell the story of their loss, helping them to work through the grief journey, which is really a life process. The grief journey is a life process, and it's a life-affirming process. But because it involves pain, sometimes we shy away from it, and because we don't really understand the purpose of it, again, we shy away from it. It is my hope that in these YouTube videos, in the Healthy Mourning YouTube channel, in the Healthy Mourning Revolution radio program, and through the Healthy Mourning Revolution free live launches, that more people will understand the difference between grief and mourning, and that they will start to employ the tools and techniques necessary to move through any buried and carried grief. Because in truth, disenfranchised grief becomes a recipe for buried and carried grief. If your society doesn't allow you to convert your grief to mourning, doesn't allow you to move through your grief process, then it's got nowhere to go but to stay inside and be buried and carried inside our beings. And that's really where physical pain and emotional pain and disease begins. And so we want to do this in a healthy way. We want to reclaim our memories, and we want to reclaim our love, and we want to find joy in our life. And so if you're finding yourself stuck in any of this, I invite you to connect with me. Go to healthymourning.com, which is my website, and join us in the next live launch, or join us for a private consultation. There are a bunch of free resources there for you. In the meantime, thank you for sharing this time and space with me. If you want to see some other videos, please click on them. Be sure to subscribe so that the next time I do a video, you're with us for the video. And let me know if there's a particular topic about grief that you would like me to speak about. I'd be happy to do a week's focus on your special topic and answer your questions. Much love to you as always. Namaste.